All right, guys, we are back for the redo of Unit 5. Last time we tried to do this, I had serious internet issues. So I'm recording a kind of quick overview of Unit 5. I'm going to go through the whole entire thing again because I know it was kind of sporadic back and forth. So this is going to cover the entirety of Unit 5. Ready to get into it? Let's get into it. We are not recording, so I'm going to go ahead and skip through this. This is just a video. Of course, social media stuff, I'm not going to cover that again, but we all know. Follow Fiveable if you haven't already. Good stuff on all their Instagram, Twitter, and YouTubes. So this is a little bit outdated, especially since we just did Unit 7. I'm recording this pretty much right after the Unit 7 stream, so there's that. But let's go ahead and get into what we're going to be doing in the stream. I'm going to be covering a quick kind of overview of Unit 5, talking a little bit about what we're planning on covering here. Then we're going to look at the rise of Great Britain, the French Revolution. We're going to look at the entirety of the French Revolution, from the causes to the kind of three different stages, and then the effects. And then lastly, we're going to look at Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna. So that's kind of the plan for this video. I am going to kind of go more quickly over kind of this first little bit, mostly just because I want to make sure I've spent a lot of time on the French Revolution, because I do think that is, out of all of this stuff, well, Napoleon's important too, but I think the French Revolution and understanding that is the most important of these different topics. But we're going to start with talking about the emergence of modern Britain. Which is kind of, I think this is really important to cover, mostly because this helps us understand how we get from point A to point B when it comes to Britain. When we last left talking about Britain here, Britain was had kind of shook off the potential threat of absolute monarchy. We kind of talk about how, historically speaking, Britain was really potentially would never face the issues of absolute monarchy with the existence of the Magna Carta. However, certainly James I and Charles I really attempted to create an absolute monarchy that the British Parliament resisted, leads to the British Civil War. We know the monarchy is going to lose the British Civil War, and Charles I gets the chop. So with that, we kind of do have this Britain, then we talked about the Glorious Revolution, and we have this Britain that is well on its way to the establishment of, certainly a constitutional monarchy, but even maybe something more, maybe even something closer to like what the United States had at that time, which was the United States being by far the most, to use 1800s terms, liberal of these Western governments. All right, so let's take a little look at kind of, what happens between the end of the Glorious Revolution to the creation of the modern British government. And after the English Civil War, the establishment of the English Bill of Rights, we do see Parliament kind of forever gaining advantage over the English monarchy. This is going to be especially true when George I takes the throne. And he is really not a very aggressive or assertive king. He's way more passive, especially when it comes to dealing with the Parliament. Because of this, Parliament's just going to be able to take a pretty easy control over the government. Although certainly one of the things that's important to remember is that the English monarchy at this time is still really in charge of the foreign policy of Britain. It's really why we tend to think, if we know anything about the American War for Independence, we know that the big bad guy is George III, right? The British monarchy. And, if we're reading this, we're like, well, wait a minute. I thought the English king really didn't have a big say over what happened in the comings of goings of Britain at this point. And the reality is that the English monarchy is, still a very, very important position. Nobody at this time would say that the English monarchy didn't do anything. The English monarchy was Britain, right? Certainly. And there was still kind of that little essence of absolutism that existed because of the importance of the British monarchy. But also we have to remember that the British monarchy was still controlled pretty much still controlled the foreign policy of England. And so because of that, when we think about the English War for Independence, because the king is still the face of Britain, because the king is still controlling the foreign policy, it makes a lot of sense why why kind of the big bad guy of the American War for Independence would be George III. But Parliament is divided up into two different bodies, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. House of Lords, like it sounds, is made up of the nobility. House of Commons is made up of the elected commoners. Parliament controlled taxation, lawmaking, and bringing grievances to the monarchy. All of that fun stuff. Now, kind of in response to the weakness, I guess you could say, of the monarchy, you see the creation of the cabinet system. And the purpose of the cabinet system was to act as a go-between between the monarchy and the parliament. The cabinet and the ministers that made up this cabinet would really meet with the king, convey whatever parliament needed to convey to the king. The king would convey whatever the king needed to convey to parliament, and they would be kind of the middleman between parliament and the king. It was really just a way more efficient way for parliament and the king to work together. That way the king could feel like he wasn't super outnumbered. That way parliament, it just really helped with that tension, right? Because one of the big issues with looking back to the English Civil War was that there was never really a go-between between parliament and the monarchy. It was parliament versus the monarchy and vice versa as well, right? The monarchy versus parliament. With the cabinet system, this is a way more diplomatic way that the king and the parliament could work together. And really the minister, so the king would choose these ministers, right? The king would choose members to serve on his cabinet. And these ministers had to be popular with parliament, right? You don't want to choose the unpopular ministers because they're not going to get anything done. They're never going to be able to convince parliament to do anything that the king wants to get done. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, because you pick popular members of the parliament, well, all of a sudden they're going to start growing in power. People are going to be way more receptive to parliament, and they're going to start seeing the cabinet as being the mouth of the king, not the mouth of the king being the mouth of the king, if that makes sense. So slowly but surely over time, we are going to see the British cabinet become more powerful, become way more of a governing body, as opposed to a sort of middleman go-between between the king and the parliament. At this time, you also see the creation of kind of the two largest political parties in Britain, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs being way more liberal, again using 1800 terminology here, while the Tories being way more conservative. And really, it's going to be the Whigs that George I and his successor George II tend to appoint themselves with or ally themselves with, and this is mostly due to a unsuccessful Tory rebellion against first. Now, again, kind of like what I just said here, by the mid-18th century, you have this kind of brand new political system that had emerged, right? A group of ministers led by a prime minister who worked to pass legislation. They predominantly came from the ruling party in the House of Commons, serve the monarch, but really remain loyal to the parliament. And really, this was seen as a far superior system to these old school, outdated, absolute systems of France or Prussia or Austria or Russia. And certainly, looking ahead a little bit, France is going to be especially susceptible to this, mostly because of the existence of things like the Enlightenment, right? The center of Enlightenment in Europe is in Paris. In a lot of ways, the center of Europe is Paris. And so you're going to have a lot of French scholars who are like, look at Britain, they're doing this like super organic democratic thing with a constitutional monarchy and representative government, and we still have an old outdated Louis XVI who is living in Versailles doing God knows what. And so really the French especially are going to be really jealous might not be the right word, but it certainly is a word to describe how they would feel when looking at the British government. Not to say that the British government didn't have its issues or have its problems, because it certainly did. But the thing is about Britain, and I can't overstate this enough, the British were really, really good. I think that's the right word. That's the right word we're going to use here. Good at doing this very slow, methodical change, right? Avoiding a popular revolution, one of the only countries in Europe to do so, by the way, by adopting slow, methodical change. It also doesn't hurt that Britain was by far the largest, strongest, biggest, baddest economic powerhouse in the world at this time. This is going to be further reinforced in the 1800s with the advent of the kind of boom of imperialism in the mid to late 1800s. But I mean, they were the biggest, most dominant economic power in the world. They had the best navy in the world, and they were seemingly, unstoppable when it came to their economic prowess. And it helped that they had embraced capitalist ideas as opposed to a place like France, where France absolutely could have been the economic powerhouse of the world, but mercantilism really limited the amount that their economy could actually expand, right? And the fact that they had kings that weren't really willing to adopt and adapt to more modern economic policies. All right, let's talk about the French Revolution. So what was the French Revolution? All right, well, as I just said, with the sort of like changing British political system, there is a lot of real kind of, unhappiness with the French political system. And the results of this unhappiness, and the results of just like decades and even centuries of really poor economic management, poor social management, is going to result in a complete overthrow of the French government by its people. Now, typically, and you might have, you might be an AP European history right now, or you might have taken a history class and your teacher has really, really gone on about the importance of the French Revolution, and it's one of the most important things to happen in history. And you know what? That's absolutely correct. The French Revolution is a massively important event. One of the most important historical events, certainly to happen in Western history, but arguably to happen in world history as a whole. And we look at this and we say, why? Why is the French Revolution so gosh darn important? Well, there's a few reasons. One, this is the first real revolution in modern history. And you might be saying, but I know dates, 1789. That comes after 1776, when the American War for Independence happened. Well, the American War for Independence is exactly that. It's a war for independence. I am talking about if the American colonists had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, landed in Britain, and overthrew the British government, yeah, that's a revolution. This is the French were the first to really say, hey, let's completely get rid of our government and install a brand new one. And you know what? This is really one of the first times in modern history that this happens. Okay, arguably this is the first time in modern history that this happens. It is going to be a blueprint for future revolutions, for future independence movements. It's going to be a blueprint for lots of different stuff. They're going to look at what went right, what went wrong, okay? And I mean, really, what went wrong. But this is really, really important and influences all other major revolutions that happen in history. The Russian Revolution, which is going to happen roughly 115, 120 years after the French Revolution, I can't do that kind of math off the top of my head, is really going to look at the French Revolution and say what went wrong, what went right, and how can we possibly adopt some of that stuff. But really, the French Revolution is the climax of all of these other big social movements that we've talked about so far in AP European history, right? The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, humanism, right? The print revolution. All of this stuff, all of these big movements that we talked about are going to climax and peak at the French Revolution. And it is going to change everything. All right, so let's look at what causes the French Revolution. So we have, typically when we're looking at the causes of the French Revolution, we're looking at two different types of causes. We're looking at long-term causes and we're looking at short-term causes. The long-term causes we can sum up pretty easily here, right? Absolutism, easy, right? That should be an easy one, right? We know that absolutism is going to be a long-term cause. It is an oppressive system. It restricts people's rights, all of that good stuff. Well, not good stuff, but you know what I mean. Second, Enlightenment ideas, okay? You have all of these Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers that are going on and on about things like constitutional monarchies. They're going on about representative governments, natural rights, all of these things that are being denied under an absolutist system. And then on the flip side, or not on the flip side, but alongside with that, running out of words today apparently, they're looking at Britain and they're like, look at what they're doing. Britain is doing it. They are doing the Enlightenment. Why can't we do it in France? And then probably the most infamous of these long-term causes is the rigid social structure of France, also called the estates system. Now, the estate system is a hangover of the Middle Ages. What I mean by that is that this was something that existed during the Middle Ages. It was a product of the Middle Ages, and it never really went away, even though Europe left the Middle Ages about 300 years before the French Revolution actually broke out. Now, the estate system was 3 estates, the first, second, and third. The first estate was made up by the clergy. The second estate was made up by the nobility, anybody with a noble title. And the third estate was everybody else. Now, if we look back, and you might say, well, why is this a product of the Middle Ages? Well, in the Middle Ages, you typically had 3 groups of people. You had those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Those who prayed, the clergy, those who fought, the nobility, and those who worked, the peasantry. And during the Middle Ages, yeah, there was some deviation to that. You had your merchants and your shopkeepers, you had, you know, your city folk. But if we're looking at like the vast majority of Europe's citizenry, it was in those 3 groups, right? You had your peasants, you had your nobility, and you had your clergy. And that kind of, it worked well and during the feudal era. But guess what? Feudalism is kind of a thing of the past, right? We have brand new economic and social and political systems now. But the estate system never really goes away, to the point where we have a system that is not representative of the vast majority of French citizens. The first estate is the clergy. They make up roughly 1 to 2% of the population. The second estate is the nobility, kind of the same deal, maybe 2 to 3% of the population. A lot of these numbers we kind of have to use our best historical guess because records are not the best from the time. And then lastly, the third estate makes up roughly 95% of the French population. It is massive. And guess what? They're not peasants anymore, right? Yeah, the peasantry and farmers make up a substantial amount of the third estate, but we also have shopkeepers and merchants. We have bookmakers. We have, you know, the middle class, this growing wealthy class of people that we're going to commonly call the bourgeoisie. And guess what? They are not part of the peasantry. They just aren't. And guess who is really susceptible to these Enlightenment ideas? The wealthy members of the third estate. And the third estate is taxed. The third estate doesn't have a lot of land, and well, compared to the first and second estate. And the third estate is denied access to political positions, to positions in the military. All in all, they are just denied rights that the first and the second estate have. So, outdated, broken social system. These are our long-term causes. All right. Let's look at the short-term causes here. The short-term causes here, we have, you know, kind of what I've been hinting at this whole, you know, leading up to Unit 5 here. The economic issues of France are numerous, and you know, we could spend a whole hour recounting them, but we can sum them up with the foolhardy wars of Louis XIV and Louis XV. Really, you know, with Louis XIV, he engages with warfare for the entirety of the last 30 years of his reign. And a lot of these wars are really, really not a lot happens, right? I mean, he doesn't really gain much for France. They really are just kind of a way for him to show his power and show his might. And in a lot of ways, these wars of Louis XIV do way more harm than actual good. Louis XV, kind of the same deal. You know, Louis XV, before he takes the throne, he is sitting at his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, sitting at his side as he's on his deathbed, and Louis XIV looks at Louis XV and he gives him a really, really important piece of advice. He says, be a peaceful king. You know, don't go to war. wars are costly and wars are detrimental. I mean, Louis XIV on his deathbed, he realizes the damage that he caused with all these wars, or at least the economic damage that he caused. I don't think really Louis XIV really cared about the amount of people that were killed, but he did realize the economic damage that was caused. And Louis XV, for the first few years of his rule, is really going to try to do just that. But sure enough, 1700s were a very turbulent time in European history. He is drawn into those wars. Most notably, the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, is going to be really economically damaging to France. And then we have Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XIV. And Louis XVI famously gets involved in the American War for Independence. The irony being that I say we as an American, but the United States probably would not have won the war for independence, or at least not as won it kind of as quickly as they did without French intervention. But that French intervention eventually led to a revolution of their own. But all of this is not necessarily uncommon in terms of the amount of economic kind of war debt that they had. At this time, Britain had more war debt than France did. But why was France so particularly susceptible to this war debt? And it had everything to do with the trouble of taxation. The French were not taxing efficiently. They weren't taxing efficiently. A lot of the tax money that was collected was falling through the cracks. And in general, there was just a lot of resistance to economic reform that was coming from the nobility, coming from the monarchy, and coming from the bourgeoisie. Another short-term cause was the unpopularity of Louis XVI. He was just a very weak and indecisive king. The best example I can give, or the best explanation I can give for hereditary monarchies and why they are so why they can be such a problem, is because when you have a hereditary monarchy, anytime you get a new monarchy, you roll the dice, right? And a 6 is a 10 out of 10 great king, right? Sometimes you roll the dice and you get that 6, and you get an amazing monarchy, a monarchy that really does a lot to change and benefit his country or her country. Sometimes you roll a 1 and you get a monarchy that actually does way more harm than good. Usually you get somewhere between a 2 and a 4. Louis XVI was like a 3. He was an okay monarchy. He wasn't great, but he wasn't bad either. I mean, he wasn't actively trying to kill his people. So there's that. But that was just not what France needed at the time. France needed like a 5 or a 6. They needed a rock star king. They needed a Louis XIV, a king that was like really, really wanted to rule. Louis XVI just didn't want to rule. He really could care less. He really wanted to go hunt. He wanted to, he was an avid locksmith. He wanted to do those kind of things. He wanted to kind of like spend his life living in luxury with no real plans or schedules or anything like that. Also, his wife, Marie Antoinette, the Princess of Austria, daughter of Maria Theresa, she moves to France as a young girl and is married to then heir to the throne, Louis. I can never remember his last name, but the future Louis XVI. And Louis Capet, I think it's Louis Capet. And I could be wrong about that though. So many Louis and last names. But the future Louis XVI. And Marie Antoinette is married to him. I think that they're married. They're married as around 14 or 15, really young. And the big issue here is Marie doesn't speak French. She is really very just unaware of the customs of Versailles and the court, and she's very homesick. She misses Austria. She misses her family, and what does she do to cope? She falls into this pattern of just spending a lot of money. And, the money that she spends is not kept a secret. And she kind of becomes the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy, right? Like, she is the symbol of the gluttony and the greed of the monarchy and of the nobility. She really gets a bad rap. I am no Marie Antoinette or Louis XVI apologist, but I do think in order to understand why the French Revolution happened, we'll understand the history of it. We need to look at the bigger picture and understand that we are not coming from one bad monarchy. We're coming from a whole entire system that was really actively working against the vast majority of French citizens. And Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were a part of it, but they were not the only part of it, right? So that brings us to the question of why here, why now? Of course, we have our long-term causes and we have our short-term causes, but we also have general class conflict. The big thing to remember with the class conflict piece, though, is that this is not the nobility versus the bourgeoisie. And I'll remind you guys, the bourgeoisie, that word refers to the wealthy middle class. But this is really about the bourgeoisie and the nobility versus the monarchy. Because remember, these people have been told their whole entire lives in this system of absolutism that the monarchy, they are everything. They are the top dog. They make all the decisions. And so when you say that there are issues in France, when you point out the economic problems, well, why can't the monarchy fix them? If the monarchy is the end all be all, why isn't the monarchy fixing these problems? Why aren't they fixing the social discrepancies? Why aren't they fixing, the fact that taxes are falling through the cracks and that, we still have a massive war debt? Why aren't they fixing these problems? And so that is really the heart of the problem here. If this was a class conflict of bourgeoisie and the nobility, we probably wouldn't have a full-scale revolution. But it wasn't. It was bourgeoisie and the nobility versus the monarchy. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the build-up to revolution. Really, when we're looking at the build-up to revolution, it all hinges on the calling of the Estates General in 1789. The Estates General was this kind of like last-ditch effort, don't press the red button unless you absolutely have to type thing. It had only been called twice before in French history, so this was a really big deal. And Louis XVI is going to be encouraged to call the Estates General because of the growing discontent within the nobility, because of the growing discontent within the bourgeoisie, and quite frankly, the growing discontent of every French person. Really, the city folk were a big driving force here. The years leading up to 1789, 1777, 1787, and 1788 were really, really poor harvest years. Not a lot of bread being grown, and on top of this, we have some of the harshest winters that France has ever seen. So you have really poor conditions. People are unhappy. People are hungry. Bread prices are through the roof. At this point, your average French person is eating between 1.5 pounds and 2 pounds of bread every single day. A lot of bread. And when bread prices go up, we are in a serious, precarious situation. And so Louis XVI is going to eventually kind of be encouraged to call the Estates General. The Estates General is really tasked with doing a few things. First and foremost, solve the economic crisis in France. That is your priority. Do that. But then all of the representatives of the estates, they form these kind of grievances. They're called the cachets, which were these lists of grievances that they had with the monarchy, they had with the nobility, they just had in general. Every time I think about the cachets, I think about I don't know if this might be out of the wheelhouse or I might be kind of showing my age a little bit, but the episode from Seinfeld of Festivus. And this is a really, really great episode. Maybe your parents made you watch it at some point, or maybe you're a Seinfeld fan, which, like, kudos to you. It's a great show. But one of the big parts of Festivus, which is this holiday that's invented by George Costanza's father, is one of the parts of it is during dinner. His father stands up and explains all of the problems and all of the issues that he has with everybody at dinner. That's kind of what I think about with the cachets, is it's people standing up and saying, I got a lot of problems and you're going to hear about them. And that's really what they wanted to do at the Estates General. They wanted to address all these other problems that they had. The calling of, or the dealing with the economic crisis, they were like, oh, that's easy peasy. That's cake. We're going to knock that out in like a week. And then we can really get into the meat and potatoes. But here's the issue. The Estates General was kind of destined to fail from the get-go. So what happens is it's a meeting of all three estates, as the name sort of suggests, and they all send representatives. Initially, it's 300 representatives from each estate. The third estate is going to say, well, we make up 95% of the population. maybe we should have more representatives. And Louis is like, yeah, I can't really argue with that logic. You guys get another 300. So we have 1,200 representatives from all three estates, 600 from the third estate, 300 from the first two estates. And they're going to get together and they're going to talk about their problems. Really the biggest one being the economic situation. However, they spent about 3 weeks arguing about how to vote, because the voting system was that every estate gets one vote for a total of 3 votes. Guess which two estates are going to be always voting together? If you guess the first two estates, you are correct. The first two estates are always going to vote together in the estates general. So what that means is that the third estate is always going to be outvoted. So eventually the third estate just says, all right, we're done with this. We're well read on Voltaire and Montesquieu and John Locke, and we're just going to go form our own representative government because, hey, we're representatives. We were elected, and we're going to go form the National Assembly. And the National Assembly sort of declared itself to be the representative body of France. Certainly, they were like, we are a body of representatives, and we're going to go get things done because this system ain't working. Now, this is going to bring us to the first of several big moments in the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is really this revolution of big, important moments. We're not going to talk about all of them here, but the first one is the Tennis Court Oath. And the Tennis Court Oath was a meeting that took place on June 20th, 1789. The long and short of the Tennis Court Oath, the National Assembly was going to meet. They find the doors to their meeting room are locked, and they're like, they're trying to keep us out. They're trying to keep us from meeting. They're trying to shut us down. The reality is someone probably just forgot to unlock the doors. There's very little evidence to suggest that this was done on purpose. But anyway, this was an act that the monarchy was trying to shut the National Assembly down. They go and they march to the nearest, largest room that was available, which was the tennis courts, which are kind of just really handball courts. They're really big, lots of room. And they get inside, and it's in there while everybody's riled up that they say, we are not going to disband until we have a constitution. And it's this really big kind of patriotic moment of coming together and having a single unifying goal. And that's the thing. Before this, they didn't really have a really big unifying goal, but now they did. Make a constitution. And this is really the first whiff we have of revolution. And we're still not really in revolution just yet. That's about to come. But this is our first big whiff of revolution. On the right here, we have one of my favorite paintings from the time period. This is a painting depicting the Tennis Court Oath. It's done by this revolutionary painter, David, and he was a propagandist. Is that a word? I just made it up. His paintings were really pieces of propaganda for the revolution. And this one really was. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it here just for time's sake, but look it up and look up the paintings of David. They're really, really something. This is one of my favorites. Now, if you know anything about the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, you should know about. This is the true start of the French Revolution. July 14th, 1789, excuse me. July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. All right, this mostly happens because Parisians, who are and will continue to be our most radical actors of the French Revolution, they get word. That the king is getting ready to go occupy the city of Paris with the National Guard, or with the army, excuse me. And the people of Paris start freaking out. They take to the streets, they're rioting, and then they decide to head to the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was this giant big stone fortress that sat right smack dab in the middle of Paris. It was a medieval fortress. At this point, it was being used as a prison to house political prisoners and a place to house gunpowder and weapons. And it kind of represents the monarchy. It kind of represents the old regime. It kind of represents really everything that they had problems with. So someone yells to the Bastille. They go to the Bastille, they storm it, and they tear out the governor of the Bastille. They cut his head off, they put it on a pike, they parade it around the city of Paris. And with this act of this first big act of violence and protest by the Parisians is considered by a lot of people to be the start of the French Revolution. Kind of the big defining act, though, is the fact that they decide to tear down the Bastille brick by brick with their hands. And it's this really, really symbolic moment of the people of Paris saying, look, this is us taking to the streets. This is us tearing down, tearing down what represents the monarchy with our bare hands. July 14th, France's Independence Day. It's Bastille Day. It's a very important symbolic moment, and this is really truly the start of the French Revolution. Now, the National Assembly is going to sort of respond to this with the night of August 14th, 1789. The night of August 14th, 1789 is really where we see the estate system kind of symbolically falling apart. It's this really symbolic moment where one by one members of the first and second estate stand up and renounce their traditional privileges, and really, and while this is more symbolic than anything else, doesn't really have that much in the way of there's really not much in the way of support from the monarchy at this point. But this is really symbolic because it shows that there is growing support not only from the third estate but from the second estate and even some of the first estate to change things in France. Really, really important. Also, in response, another really kind of important symbolic thing here is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This was a proclamation by the National Assembly that outlines the basic rights that all men have in France. I mean, this is really the Enlightenment in action, right? It's very heavy on Enlightenment ideas. Really short. I encourage you guys to go out and read it. It really gives you guys a good understanding of what the goals were of the French Revolution. One of the things that becomes very apparent is that this was just the beginning, right? There was more that was coming, and they really had a lot of lofty goals for changes that they wanted to happen. Now, one person I like to include when I talk about the Declaration of the Rights of Man is Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges, kind of not in protest, because that's not the right word, but kind of in response to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, publishes the Declaration of the Rights of Women. And this is going to show that, her and other French revolutionaries wanted to expand rights beyond just men. They wanted to expand them to women as well. And Olympe de Gouges is really one of our kind of early, again, I've talked about early feminists. Olympe de Gouges definitely falls into that camp. All right, so the end of the old regime here. So really the end of the old regime is signified by the move of the monarchy from Versailles to the city of Paris. This happens when an angry mob storms out of Paris, heads to Versailles, and forcefully removes the monarchy from Versailles back to Paris and sticks them in the Tuileries Palace, where they will effectively be kept under lock and key for the next few years. And the March on Versailles and the subsequent move to Paris is really going to be seen as this is the end of the old regime. Versailles, the doors are shut. No longer will it ever serve as a seat of power for the future French government. And the National Assembly also moves to Paris. And this is really it. This is the end of the old regime. This is a huge turning point in French history already. Now, under the new monarchy, we see a few things happen early on. The first is that we see the establishment of a constitutional monarchy that looked really, really similar to Britain's, where you still had a king. The king still had some power. The king was, still at this point a really, really important part of this government. But the National Assembly was really there to limit the power of the king. You also see changes to the clergy. The civil constitution of the French clergy really limited the power of the clergy in France and made the Catholic Church in France a really state-run organization. And this is really the first time that we see a true shift away from the revolution working with religion as a whole. Now, at the end of 1791, the National Assembly became the Legislative Assembly. This new representatives, this was much more of a representative body of elective representatives that were, this is really where we see we are now in a true elected, this is their job to run this representative assembly. And overall, the revolution up to this point had been pretty successful. We see the establishment of a representative body and a constitution. We see a nobility that had given up its special rights and given up its privileges. And we see a clergy that was run by the state. We also see men gaining some level of individual rights and legal equality. But one thing that's important to understand is that this was only really helping the First Estate, and not even really the First Estate, right? Some members of the First Estate, some members of the Second Estate, and some members of the Third Estate. It really only the wealthy members that really wanted these like basic Enlightenment ideas. It had not addressed the concerns of the Parisians, and really the old school nobility, they weren't happy either. And so this is going to bring us towards the radical republic, or the radical phase of the revolution. Sorry, my voice is going, guys. So, kind of like what I just said, if we look at who benefited from the first phase, it was the peasants and it was the bourgeoisie. We didn't really talk about the peasants too much just because of lack of time. We can review that in the CRAM finale if need be. Who did it not benefit? Did not benefit the Parisians, did not benefit the royal family or the high aristocracy. Now, slowly but surely, there is going to be a push for radicalization, mostly by radical Parisians who earned the nickname the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes standing for without knee breeches. They did this in protest of the knee breeches who were kind of famously worn by the nobility and the bourgeoisie. And we also see the rise of really important political clubs. These political clubs were exactly that. They were places where people could get together and talk about politics. They could talk about the comings and goings of the time, and they are going to become increasingly places of radicalization. The Jacobin Club being the most important here. And what's really going to further radicalize the French Revolution is the wars of the French Revolution, which break out because of the Austria and Prussia seeing the French Revolution as a direct threat. In April of 1792, war is declared against Austria and Prussia, and this war is going to last for 23 years. You also have individual members of the French Revolution that are also pushing towards radicalization. People like Jacques Danton and Jean-Paul Marat. Jacques Danton was this really incredibly popular figure. People tend to think of Maximilien Robespierre when they think about the revolution, but Jacques Danton is really who represents this early stage of the revolution. Incredibly popular, great orator, and the leader of the Jacobin Party. Jean-Paul Marat, kind of similar here, a radical journalist. He's going to help spread rumors in Paris that of sedition and of treason. He famously writes the newspaper Friend of the People. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the French name of it because my French is terrible. He's going to effectively just publish lists of people who are traitors towards France. Now, what's going to eventually happen here is by the time we get to 1792, September of 1792, we see Louis XVI removed pretty much officially from his duties. We see the establishment of the National Convention, and we see France declared a republic. This is going to eventually lead us to the execution of Louis XVI, which takes place in January of 1793. This comes on the heels of his attempted flight to Austria, which ends in failure. He's seen as a traitor, and kind of very, very narrowly, the National Convention votes to have him executed. He is executed in January of 1793. A few months later, his wife Marie Antoinette is also executed. And with this, we kind of start to see the rolling executions that become so synonymous with the radical phase of the revolution. Now, while this is all happening, we see a lot of rebellion start to brew against the revolution. The revolution was really only widely supported in Paris. Outside of Paris and the rest of France, we start to see rebellion against the revolution break out. This rebellion in the Vendée, as it becomes kind of known, really is sparked by the death of the royal family and the civil constitution of the French clergy. Rebellion breaks out in 60 of the 83 provinces, and it is put down generally very, very harshly. But it also leads to the increased radicalization of the Republic. And this brings us to the Committee of Public Safety, which is formed in June of 1793. The Constitution is suspended, and the Committee of Public Safety is formed to effectively rule the country. This is a 12-man council. They are seen as the only option to get the revolution back on track, and their goal is to strike fear in the hearts of their enemies and strike a hope in the hearts of their allies. They really want to commit a reign of terror. They really use those words exactly, no sugarcoating about it. And of course, who's going to step up to the plate here but Maximilien Robespierre, the guy that most people associate with the revolution. Incredibly influential Jacobin, incredibly impressive public speaker. He believed that he must create a republic of virtue to stamp out the traitors of revolutionary France. Heavily influenced by Rousseau, heavily influenced by the ideas that that society in itself is naturally corrupt and that society must be reformed from its very roots in order to achieve a more virtuous, I feel like I've been using the word society, but a virtuous society. This leads us to the Reign of Terror, though. And the Reign of Terror really targeted anybody that was deemed as a enemy of the revolution. Initially, this targeted any initial supporters of the revolution who had fallen out of favor. Olympe de Gouges is subject to, or falls victim to the Reign of Terror. Jacques Danton falls victim to the Reign of Terror. And then eventually it's going to go to anybody who opposed any part of the Reign of Terror. If you spoke poorly about a local government official, if you cried at the death of your husband who was executed, odds are you were getting the chop, you were getting executed. When all said and done, roughly 200,000 to 400,000 people would be in prison, with another 25,000 to 50,000 people being killed, 17,000 of those being in Paris alone. Now, in result, in response to this radical revolution, we do see the Thermidorian reaction. By 1794, the French military was now having a lot of victories. They were securing victories against the Austrians and the Prussians. The terror was growing increasingly out of favor, and Robespierre was getting more radical. He was getting, he was looking at all these victories and saying, no, now is the time that we need to kill more people. Now is the time we need to get more radical. And on July 27th, 1794, the National Convention effectively cleaned house, killing everybody that was that associated with Robespierre, all of his allies, arresting them, and then executing them. Robespierre is guillotined in July or late July of 1790. So that brings us towards what is usually considered to be the last stage of the French Revolution, which is typically called the Directory. So we have the sort of constitutional monarchy phase, or the liberal phase of the revolution, as it's called, the radical phase of revolution, and then the Directory, or the last phase of revolution. 1795, the Directory is established, which was this council that worked with the elected parliament, or the elected representatives, and they acted as sort of like the executive branch of the French government. In general, this was really unsuccessful. The Directory is very weak. It's full of corruption. Violence is still happening. It's just, all in all, the revolution got out of hand, and really, in reality, This is the perfect situation for someone to step in and say, hey, I can fix France. In comes Napoleon. So let's talk about Napoleon. So Napoleon is going to be, in a lot of ways, the perfect product of the French Revolution, right? Here is a guy who is able to ride on the wave of French Revolution. He's able to ride the wave of relative obscurity into the national spotlight, then seize power when France is at really its most chaotic and its most vulnerable. So Napoleon, he is Corsican. He comes from the island of Corsica. He comes from a very, very minor noble family, but that does give him access to the military. And that's kind of, he sees the military as a real way of moving up in the world. And so he joins the army at a young age. He becomes a master of the artillery. He becomes a really, really important piece of the revolutionary puzzle. During the revolution, he is going to work to stamp out counter-revolutionary movements in Vendée, even in Paris itself. And he is also going to lead relatively successful campaigns in Italy and then again in Egypt. And it's these Italian and Egyptian campaigns that are going to be really put him on the national spotlight. He's going to be really a household name even before he goes on his Egyptian campaign. In fact, there's a lot of thought that the Directory sends Napoleon on the Egyptian campaign in order to pretty much get him out of France because he's becoming so popular. This is going to eventually lead to Napoleon's infamous or famous, depending on what side you land on, coup d'etat, where him, along with several other members of the Directory, overthrow the government and establish a brand new constitution. And this new constitution is going to put Napoleon in charge. And there's also going to be a representative body as well. But it's really going to give Napoleon pretty much the full extent of the power. And this constitution, which is voted on, is approved almost overwhelmingly by French citizens, which kind of suggests that they were over this chaotic revolution. They wanted stability. Now, Napoleon is going to institute a lot of reforms early on that is going to really solidify his popularity. The Concordat, which brings back Catholicism, but also opens up the door towards Protestantism and Judaism. He creates the Legion of Honor, which is the way that he kind of curtails the nobility. The Napoleonic Code, of course, which is our modern legal system that is going to become immensely popular not only in France but also outside of France. He creates the Bank of France, which is going to solidify and stabilize the French economy, and he's going to institute a kind of universal French education system with universal curriculum that is going to make sure that the if you receive your education in Lyon, it's going to be comparable to your education in Paris. All of these domestic reforms, I gotta say, are really, really popular. They're really popular with the people of France who have been living under this like constant craziness for the last 10 years. Now, in 1804, Napoleon does crown himself emperor, again, to the overwhelming support of his French citizens, and he declares France an empire. And he really feels like in order to maintain his power, he has to go a conquering. He has to go on conquest throughout Europe. And on land, it looks like Napoleon can't be stopped. He builds this massive army that's kind of like created along these boundaries of nationalism. And the loyalty of his troops is really, really just like out of this world. But one of his big failures early on in this big movement to conquer land is the continental system. And the continental system was the system for trying to pretty much curtail the power of the British monarchy, of Britain, excuse me, by blockading Europe. Continental system fails entirely. It's a massive failure for Napoleon, and it's going to be one of kind of his biggest early failures of his French Empire. We'll talk more about the continental system during the CRAM finale, though. Again, one of my favorite paintings to come out of this time of Napoleon after he is crowned himself emperor, crowning his empress Josephine. Now, as Napoleon is conquering Europe, and Napoleon does conquer Spain, he conquers Italy, he conquers Prussia and Austria. And by conquering, I mean, along with conquering territory, also creating treaties that are that really pretty much establish puppet governments in a lot of these areas. As he's doing this, as he's conquering Europe, he's also creating a lot of resistance and resentment towards his rule. And as we know and as we look forward into the rise of nationalism, he does eventually he does end up kind of inadvertently causing nationalism to grow in places like Prussia, in places like Hungary, in places like Austria, and really we see a lot of growing resistance to Napoleon, and this resistance is going to be a major drain to French resources, which is going to really come to a head with the invasion of Russia, which we know is just a massive failure across the board. Napoleon sees Russia as like the big last thing, the big goal that he has to achieve. And he invades Russia with an army of roughly between 600 and 700,000 men, if not more, in 1812. And if we know anything about Russia, is that it's really big, and it's really hard to navigate during the winter. Also, on top of this, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, has no qualms with burning the territory, burning his own territory as he retreats. And that's kind of his big goal. He's like, look, I'm never going to beat Napoleon in a head-to-head contest. We're going to retreat. He's going to run out of resources. Eventually, he's going to leave, and we can go on the counterattack. And this is a pretty good strategy. Eventually, Napoleon is going to be forced to retreat as they are running out of supplies. Their supply lines are really weak. He's forced to retreat, and Russia goes on the counteroffensive. But when all said is done, Napoleon leaves with roughly about 10% of the army that he walked in with, losing roughly 500,000, if not more, men. So, obviously, huge drain on his resources. Now, all of this is going to lead to the downfall of Napoleon, which is going to take place very shortly after in 1813 with the Battle of Leipzig. Kind of like the French Revolution, people are tired. They're like, look, we don't want to fight anymore. We're kind of over this Napoleon guy, and he's eventually defeated in battle, and he is forced into exile to the island of Elba. Now, if we know anything about Napoleon, we know that he does not stay in Elba very long, and he is going to return back to France in 1815. This is his 100 days, because it lasts for 100 days. He lands in southern France and kind of goes on this victory march from southern France all the way to Paris. When he gets in Paris, he's pretty much handed the keys to the kingdom, and in this really weird turn of events, he is made effectively emperor again. And the French people are stoked. They're like, hey, it's Napoleon. We love this guy. Totally forgetting that they disposed of him just a few years prior. Now, Napoleon's campaign is only going to last 100 days because the rest of Europe is going to be like, what the heck? Like, we just got rid of you. How many times do we have to teach you this, old man? And they are going to defeat him in the Battle of Waterloo. And they're going to say, okay, look, if you obviously can't be trusted to not come back to Europe, so we're going to exile you to an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that's the island of St. Helena, and he will die there just a few years later in relative unhappiness. Not a very happy retirement for Napoleon. Okay, so that is a very lengthy Unit 5, but we did it in just under an hour, which is, pat myself on the back there. Now, what is the big long and short of this? Well, this is going to change Europe entirely. In a lot of ways, Unit 7 and Unit 8, or Unit 6, Unit 7, are really about looking at the impacts of the French Revolution and looking at the impacts of Napoleon, right? So we talked about the Congress of Vienna at the start of Unit 6, and we know that the powers of Europe are going to have to get together, and they're going to have to say, wow, what was that? And, how do we fix it? So that is what Unit 6 and Unit 7 are all about, but I'm going to go ahead and end things there. Thank you guys so much. If you're watching this video, thank you guys so much. Please let me know in the Discord if you have any questions. Speaking of which, join the Discord. It's really awesome. Lots of great students in there answering questions. I'm in there answering questions. Our wonderful TA Charlie's in there answering questions as well. So if you have any questions after this video, please feel free to watch. And of course, thank you guys for tuning in. My name is Steven. Thank you for Fiveable for having us all together here, and I'll see you guys next time.